going to say the same to you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. You know, you can always tell when you've had a really successful session when you run out of time before you run out of questions, and I think we've had that already today, and I think we're going to run into that one again here. So for our next and final panel of the day, we're going to look at the end of the Normandy campaign, the Allied breakout and the German collapse. So here today to chair this panel is another longtime friend and colleague at the museum, Dr. Rob Citino. Rob is known as one of America's most distinguished military historians. He is the recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for the body of his contributions to the field of military history from the Society of Military History. After first joining the museum in 2016 as our Samuel Zemurray Stone historian, Rob has continued helping us as a distinguished fellow in the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. So he is no stranger to most people in this room and the friend of many. So at this one, Rob, I'll pass it on over to you.
Thanks so much, Pete. Appreciate that very much. So here is our last panel, the Allied breakout and the German collapse. And to me, this kind of sums up my experience working at the National World War II Museum. You get to meet people like Bob Balmer here on my immediate right. I've read a lot of Bob's books, and I said, boy, those are good books, but we had never had an opportunity to meet before. And so you get to see those grizzled veterans, those fixtures in the field that have been delighting you with their work for so long. And next to Bob, we have Jenny Grant, who is one of those up-and-comers and the bright new blood that's going to keep military history and the history of World War II vital for so long into the future. And so this is what I loved working here. You get to meet everybody, your veterans and also your new folk as well. We have a fascinating panel here, I think, today. We're going to start with talking about Bob. Bob is the author of 4 books. I could read all 4. They're in the booklet for you, but I asked him before, which ones would you want me to mention? And for today's purposes, his book, Old Hickory, which is a history of the 30th Infantry Division, seems to be the most germane, along with a book he co-wrote with Mark Reardon, correct? Which is American Iliad, a history of the 18th Infantry Regiment. Bob's going to be delighting us with an operational précis of the American breakout at Cobra, and immediately afterwards, the German response to the American breakout, especially their often referred to as their abortive, I would say disastrous, counteroffensive at Mortain. So that'll be Bob. He's going to bring that to a certain point, and we're going to then hand off to Jenny. Jenny is a historian of the Polish army in the West. Now, when I say that, I'm fully aware as an undergraduate professor for so long in my life, most Americans aren't really aware there was a sort of a significant Polish military contribution to the campaign in the ETO. We know Poland, early in the war, they got invaded by the Germans, and they got dispatched in a month. And then they got talked about at Yalta. That's sort of how most people see the Poles. But if you visit military cemeteries, Allied military cemeteries in Italy and in Western Europe, you'll get a good look at exactly what the Poles and the Polish army contributed to the Allied victory in the war. Jenny comes to us from she's a postgraduate researcher at Queen Mary University of London. She studies the Anglo-Polish Agreement of 1939, for those who keep you all au courant. That's the British guarantee to the Poles that if they were attacked by the Germans, Britain, and then France dragged along soon afterwards, would be at the side of Poland. She comes to this interest quite honestly. She's the granddaughter of Poles who were deported to Siberia in 1940 after the Germans had invaded, and then the Soviets came in a couple weeks later from the opposite direction. You can find her online on Twitter, or is it X now, at hashtag Silence in Polish. She's spoken widely, numerous blogs. She's appeared on podcasts and videos. So that being said, let's hand it over first of all to my friend Bob Balmer to talk to us about the American Army and the German counteroffensive at Mortain.
Thank you and good afternoon, and thanks for sticking around. We'll try to keep this succinct, on point, so we can all get out of here and have cocktail hour in a bit.
Oh, sorry.
Without further ado, no. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction, and thank you to the museum for the hospitality and the invitation. I was quite honored to be invited here. Most people look at me who don't know me, and if somebody points at me and says, "You know who that guy is?" Most people just go, "No, there's nothing special about this guy." Well, he's a military historian. Huh? Well, did he serve in the Army? So let me answer those questions for you to get started, okay? I have a strange relationship with the Army. I graduated reasonably well-placed in my high school class, and to my surprise, one day I got a letter in the mail from the United States Military Academy informing me that I have been appointed as a first alternate. So up to Fort Devens, I grew up in Connecticut, so up to Fort Devens, Massachusetts I go. I take my physical, and about 2 weeks later, I get another letter from West Point, disinviting me to the academy. I wasn't academically qualified, okay? I think what they meant by that was my SAT scores weren't good enough. Okay? So off to college I go, to the University of Illinois, and it was a strange time. There was the Vietnam War brewing. There was not a lot of people that I was in school with who were volunteering to serve. We all waited around for the draft and that infamous date when our birth dates were pulled out of a, whatever it was, I can't remember, because we were all drinking pitchers of beer, being real adult-like. And I'll never forget that night because the fate of 25 of us was spelled out. Half my fraternity class ended up in Vietnam. I was not amongst them. I'm embarrassed to tell you what my draft lottery number was, but I will share with you that it's my birthday tomorrow. If you Google it, you'll say, okay, 366? How did he do that? So needless to say, the last thing anyone I went to college with would ever have expected was that I would become a, quote, military historian or have interest in military history. I finally graduated summa cum finally from the University of Illinois, and I end up going to work for IBM in Chicago. So I wore the uniform of an IBMer, white button-down shirt, dark suit, wingtips, for a number of years. Fast forward to 1992. My father calls, and he says, my Aunt Catherine's in the hospital in Waterbury. She's dying. She's there with Mary Jane. We need to go now. So I respond to the order. I meet him in the elevator. We get up to the third floor where his 99-year-old aunt is being tended to by her 92-year-old kid sister. And we don't say anything. She's the first to speak up. She looks at my father and says, Sonny, I know that's you. But Bobby, how can you be here? You were killed during the war. That's when my life changed. That's the moment I became interested in military history. My father never talked about his brother. I knew he had one. We got down to the ground floor after we visited Catherine. I said, Dad, you never talked about your brother. What happened to him? He said he was killed on the beachhead in Normandy. What a waste. I don't want to talk about this anymore. If you want to know more, talk to Mary Jane. Well, Mary Jane was a retired first lieutenant, United States Army, served in the Nurse Corps, both the European and Pacific theaters. So Mary Jane was pretty well equipped. She had been in command of an orthopedic ward in England after the invasion. She took me to see my dead brother's grave. And it's an experience when you look down and you see your name on a stone, Army issue, his date of birth, KIA, June 9, 1944, Company H, 18 INF, 1st INF. Translated, Heavy Weapons Company, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. Years went by where I began to explore his war. And I'm looking at Time, Life magazines and publications, real big picture stuff. Well, I could figure out that he went to North Africa because he had enlisted in 1940. He'd been to North Africa already. He survived North Africa. He went to Sicily, got through Sicily, got back to Normandy. Not Normandy, of course, but I meant England before he went to Normandy. But the thing I couldn't get an answer to, and any of you who are here today because someone in your family was killed during the war that you never knew can probably relate to this. I wanted to know what happened to him. How did he die? I found out before the internet. It's a complex story. I won't get into it, except to say that I found his best friend, the only guy that survived the hit on their mortar squad. One guy survived. He lived in Greenville, South Carolina. We talked on the phone. He explained it all to me. I said, okay, you're done. This is all you want to know. A couple years later, I'm now versed on the internet. I can actually go to a website. There was a 18th Infantry Regiment Association website then. You look at the guest list, they'd sign whoever had visited the site. And I saw Colonel Robert E. Murphy, United States Army, retired. So I emailed the webmaster. And I say, is that the same Robert E. Murphy who was the Company H captain back then? Yes, it is. Can I contact him? No, it doesn't work that way. We'll let him know you're interested. If he's got interest, he'll let you through. Fast forward now to 2000. I'm invited by Colonel Murphy to attend the Combat Officer Dinner Reunion in Washington, D.C. of the 1st Infantry Division. I meet all these guys whose names I had read in reports. From him, the company commander, to battalion commanders, others. It was an amazing experience. During this time, as Rob intimated, I had befriended Mark Reardon, who was with the Center of Military History. We had put together really what were monograph-sized documents that depicted some of my interviews with 18th Infantry veterans. How did I break into having my name in print in a book? Are you ready for this? It was 2004. The book received a Pulitzer Prize award, or its author did. He was here yesterday. His name is Rick Atkinson. I was in 2 footnotes. I'm published. Well, that's not exactly how it ended. I was invited by the veterans of the 18th Infantry Regiment to write that book, which I did, and it was published a year later. So it was quite a journey for me. I am not lettered like so many that were here today, with something like a PhD after my name. I am passionate. I do not regard myself as a bona fide military historian, but I have learned that you need to use primary sources, interviews, you don't rely on second sources, and the books I've written since then have been fairly decently received. But you came here today to listen to me talk about Normandy and the Breakout. And as Rob pointed out, we're really going to do four things together. We're going to highlight the outcomes from Operation Cobra, which began on the 24th of July. We're going to review what the situation was post-Cobra, mainly through the lens of what Joe Collins saw in the sector of the 7th Army. We're then going to arrive at a little place on a map called Mortain, France. How many of you have heard of Mortain? That's a pretty good number. How many of you heard of Bastogne? The point will be made as we continue talking. The Germans realized that they were about to lose the Battle of France. So we're going to introduce you to the lineup on the German side that went at Mortain, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Mortain from a map reconnaissance standpoint. You're going to be in command. You are the armchair generals. I'm going to be briefing you on what went down. And then we're going to set the stage for the events that followed, which Jenny's going to describe to you. Operation Cobra. Look up in the air. What do you see up there? You see a B-17? Way up there. On July 24th, there was going to be a saturation bombing of the carpet in front of what was the jump-off point for Operation Cobra. The instructions, as General Bradley understood them, would have the air forces coming in parallel, like this way, to the line. It was cloudy that morning. Chief Air Marshal Mallory was in France. He looked up in the sky and saw clouds and said, "We can't do this." So he called it off. But about 300 planes didn't hear the order. Now, if you looked up and saw that B-17 in display above you, now imagine that's a 500-pound bomb. They landed on our side of the line. The rest of the day's attack order was called off. There was some screaming and yelling. The next morning, they delay the start of the airdrop to be sure that the skies are going to be clear by a couple of hours. And as Bradley wrote in his soldier story book after the war, they did it again. They came in perpendicular and not parallel to the line. Hundreds of casualties. That was the beginning. The Germans also experienced heavy losses. By the time Cobra, the initial phase of Cobra, was completed, 3 infantry divisions, the 352nd, the 353rd, and the 275th, were no longer functioning as a cohesive fighting unit. Panzer Lehr which had caused a great deal of trouble for forces trying to get down to St. Lo in the early part of July, was wiped out. The Germans suffered and helped us in a lot of ways because they had their tanks forward, right in the line of fire of our planes. So they had put their tanks forward and their infantry behind them. What that meant was, as Joe Collins lit the bright light of democracy and said, "We attack," despite the setback from the bombings, the Germans could only maintain scattered pockets of resistance. Their infantry would have to fight in the open. And when they sought the cover of darkness, Collins said, "We ain't going to let them use that to hide from us. We attack tonight." He kept them moving. It was a lightning speed attack. It's no wonder that it only took 72 hours to complete the initial objectives outlined by General Bradley for Operation Cobra. So we find ourselves shortly after this. Oh, it's up already. I'm sorry. Who put that up there? This was the situation immediately beyond Cobra. Now, maps are hard to follow. I'm going to try to keep it simple. The German defenses had to be established south of our line at the end of July. That was maintained by the 116th Panzer Division, who expected to attack northward towards Percy. Instead, they were to line up and establish a line further south that would go closer to the town of Eyre. Meanwhile, Bradley's now fit to be tied. He wants to keep going, as does Collins. The 1st Division is ordered to keep moving towards Bracy. You see Bracy down there on the left near Avranches? So that's where the 1st Division gets ordered to, while the 4th and 9th Division keep safe the flank of the 1st Division, where the dotted line appears now more to your right, gets a little squiggly. Y'all with me? Once the 1st Division gets to Bracy, Collins says, "Keep moving. We want you to go down to Mortain." The 1st Division gets to Mortain on August 2nd. 2 days later, Collins says, "Keep moving. We now want you to go south to Mayenne." Okay. So there's a bunch of things going on around 7th Army. They were retreating on the west coast of the continent, and on the 1st of August, word got to the German command that the Americans were already in Avranches. The Germans now decide we have to do something about this. This guy, von Kluge, commander of German forces in the West, confers with Hitler's headquarters. Hitler's headquarters gets word to the Fuhrer. He wants an immediate counterattack with every available Panzer Division in Normandy. Von Kluge calls Hans von Fonck, They get together, they start working out the problems of trying to get every panzer division in Normandy ready to attack and reclaim Avranches. That doesn't work out so well between them because there's the conflict with Hitler. There's the back and forth about who's ready, who's got the combat power to do this. Well, the way it ended was they found 4 panzer divisions. One was the 1st SS Panzer Division, Adolf Hitler, commanded by Teddy Wish. His claim to fame, he was an original member of Hitler's bodyguard company in 1933. He's a pretty nasty guy. 2nd Panzer Division, Das Reich, commanded by Otto Baum. He was there when Poland was invaded. He had also fought on the Russian front and France. Good deal of experience. Then there was this guy, Heinrich von Lüttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division. Can you imagine looking that guy in the eye and trying to salute him? How do you maintain eye contact? And finally, the 116th Panzer Division, commanded by Gerhard Graf von Schwerin. Thank you, Rob. He wasn't quite as experienced as the other guys. He'd been to Russia. But what he was known for is extraordinarily strong allegiance to his men and his division. He was combative. He fought more with his command than he did with the Americans. Nevertheless, he was chosen to be one of 4 divisions. They were going to come up against one division. The combined power of the German attacking force was approximately 300 combat assets, which translated in military parlance to Mark IIIs, Mark IVs, Panthers, dual-purpose 88 millimeter guns, Panzerfausts, the heavy equipment it took to create a lot of destruction, with many attached Panzer Grenadier units, such that the combined manpower of the attacking force was near 80,000 men. Operation Ludick was its name. On the left side of the picture that's in front of you is Major General Leland Hobbs, commander of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. As the name implies, they were Southern boys, Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee. They mixed in a few Midwesterners and others from the West Coast as they geared up to come overseas. Hobbs had seen no combat. He missed War I. He saw about a half a day of fighting on the Mexican border in 1915. He saw 10 days of combat working their way down the east side or the west side of the Vire River to get to the breakout, the jump-off point for the Cobra breakout at St. Lo. His division had endured 17 counterattacks, mainly aimed at his leading infantry components, conducted by Panzer Lehr and other units. He had lost about 20% of his strength when he was called out of the line. 2 days later, he found his division departing Tessy-sur-Vire for Mortain. with about 12,000 men. 2 days rest. On the right is his assistant division commander, William K. Harrison. How many have heard of him before? You would. Assistant division commander. We've all heard of Teddy Roosevelt. We met assistant division commanders of current day, 1st ID and 4th Division, serving members of the military today. Assistant division commanders were supposed to be the eyes and ears for the division commander. They were supposed to, by example, be in the front. Harrison went to West Point, as did Hobbs. Hobbs lettered in baseball, basketball, and football. And back then you could do that because they were winter, spring, and fall sports. Harrison did none of that. He was an administrative type. Nevertheless, he ends up as assistant division commander. But to give you some kind of an idea as to the kind of thing he was made of, when Cobra jumped off the second day and more bombs came down, there was one company ready to jump off, the lead company, Company F of the 120th Infantry Division. How many of you heard about General McNair getting killed in those bombings? He was in the 120th Infantry Command Post. Harrison was a few hundred feet forward of him with the leading Company F. They got hit pretty hard. Harrison somehow maintained the presence of mind to answer the question of his troops, what do we do now? Harrison said, we attack, of course. Only if we have 4 or 5 men, we still attack. That's the kind of leader he was. So they're called to Mortain. Now we're going to do another map reconnaissance. We're going to keep this simple because maps can be very complicated. Do you see where Mortain is on the map? About in the middle, a little bit to the right of center. Okay? To the east of Mortain is a hill mass, 314 feet high. That's over 1,000 feet. It was the primary military objective of the Germans. Reason? From its heights, on a clear day, you could see all the way to Avranches. And if they were going to march tanks to Avranches, they wanted to control their own artillery batteries protecting that movement, as opposed to the Americans being able to have that key terrain advantage. Above Mortain, there's a smaller town called St. Barthélemy. That was the important point, and really the other important point that you need to know about, because that's where the 2nd Panzer Division was going to hit first to open the way for the 2nd Panzer Division Das Reich to break through. That's really all you need to know about the key terrain around Mortain. The 30th Division took over the positions that were held by the 1st Division. The location of the units are all up there. Key, again, the defense of Hill 314, 1,000 feet up. They took over positions foxhole for foxhole. St. Barthélemy, out farther west towards Gervigny. I have trouble with French, folks, so bear with me. Was where the roadway continued, and you can't see it, but just off the map is Avranches. Hobbs gets a call. It's from Joe Collins, and he says, it's quiet at Mortain. There's nothing going on. First Division said that there's been some light action, but can you spare a couple of battalions? We need one to go out to St. Hilaire. We need one to go down to Dumfront. So what are you going to say to Joe Collins? You're going to say yes, right? So Hobbs gives up 3 battalions. He's now understrengthed. He's down under 10,000 men, and he's got no reserves. It was cloudy. It was foggy. It was rainy on the night of August 6th and 7th. If you were near St. Barthélemy, you would hear Germans hooting and hollering and screaming Heil Hitler like they were drugged up. But it's supposed to be quiet around here. So Das Reich orders an artillery attack on St. Barthélemy to quiet things down so the Americans can't hear them. Then there's radio traffic. And it goes something like this. Ultra, if you're familiar with Ultra, it's that decrypt that we were able to develop with Bletchley Park, discovers movement, but it's too vague to do anything about it. It's still early in the evening, but Das Reich breaks radio silence and essentially says, we're going to hit Mortain, and then we're going to go further. Now it's becoming more suspicious. 30th Division hasn't been told any of this yet, okay? Because they're trying to put the picture together. Another intercept comes at closer to 11 o'clock. Now it's more specific rather. They're going to hit at 00 midnight. They're going to hit south of Mortain, and they're going to hit St. Barthélemy. Hobbs reads in his logbook a notice at about 38 minutes into the next day that a counterattack is suspected. First notice. What happens quickly, and the defining defense happened on the first day. Das Reich came in south of the city of Mortain, busted up some roadblocks, went up the Grand Rue, the main street. Artillery rained in. They captured the entire command post of the battalion that was there. Everyone was forced to surrender. They started charging Hill 314. They took out one company, took them completely by surprise, captured the mortars of the heavy weapons company, but were pushed off the hill. They couldn't stay. North of Mortain, where Das Reich was expected to break through after the 2nd Panzer Division, hit, didn't go so well. A platoon and a half of towed 3-inch guns and one understrength infantry battalion stopped 30 tanks cold. Now it's daylight. And British Typhoons come in. They score an additional 76 flamers, 76 smokers, and another 20 or 40 German assets destroyed. That didn't end the battle for Mortain, but it stopped them. The Germans fought for Hill 314 for 5 days. They didn't give up, nor did the Americans. There was a surrender demand. That surrender demand there were several interpretations of what was actually said when this nattily dressed German came up in uniform, all polite with a white flag of surrender, and approached the company captain and demanded surrender. There were three versions of that: eyewitness, the Stars and Stripes version, and the version that went back to the New York Times editors. What he really said, according to the eyewitnesses, started with an F-bomb. The Stars and Stripes reported it as, "Screw you, we will never surrender until every one of our bullets has been used and our bayonets are sticking into a German belly." They were finally rescued 5 days later. The key thing to understand about Mortain was that it clearly was a team effort. The division was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, the first to be offered. Long story, but it was never awarded. But what made the difference then is their defense at Mortain allowed the subsequent events that took place from 12 to 21 August, which permitted the encircling of a German army to take place because the 30th Division had stood strong at Mortain. Bradley called them the Rock of Mortain. Thank you.
Very good evening to everybody. My thanks to Connie, the World War II Museum, for inviting me to speak. On a personal level, it is nice to be warm for the first time in about a year. To Rob for chairing. To all of you for sticking through to the bitter end of these D-Day events, unlike my Prime Minister, for example. So, as Rob was saying, my work focuses on the practical implications of the Anglo-Polish alliance, what it means to knit together an alliance around massive disparities in resources, geopolitical status, culture, language, ultimate strategic objectives. We had some, I think, whining from the Canadians earlier. I mean, if it helps, the Americans punch down on the Brits and the Brits punch down on the Canadians, but the Brits and Canadians helped together to punch down on the Poles who looked up and thought we're all duplicitous bastards. So I suppose as we stand here on the anniversary of D-Day +1, it is one of the most amazing things that the alliance of Western countries held firm. Our countries were not perfect, but we recognized what evil was, and our determination to defeat it held steady. But there is an inevitable tension between the national and international in any coalition. And we see this symbolically as the bodies of men from various nations died on French soil, were hastily buried in small French cemeteries, and then once combat had passed, were exhumed and separated out into national cemeteries or repatriated. And we also see it culturally after the war as each of the allies developed narratives which adopted a national focus and rather sidelined the existence of an alliance at all. And we see this in every country in the West. Perhaps it's inevitable, but it also has the power to hurt. One of the consequences of the war is that over 100,000 Polish servicemen made their homes in Britain. But the Polish perspective has not been blended into British or indeed American cultural understandings of the war. So I can only imagine that General Maciek and his soldiers would be delighted to be bringing today's program to an end. It is recognition of their contribution. Montgomery describes them as the cork in the Falaise bottle. Can I just bring up my slide? Perfect, thank you. Okay, I was going to, I'd like to share this photograph. I'll pass over it quickly. Churchill has just been gifted an enormous globe by the US War Office. And I'm sure he's deeply grateful, but he does have the air of one thinking, where the hell do I put this? And I usually use this globe to sort of speculate about the scope of the Polish presence. You would see them obviously concentrated in occupied Poland itself, with the Home Army. Towards the east, you'd have the Polish armed forces in the east. You have Poles in gulags across Siberia. You have Polish refugees in India, in Africa, in Mexico. You also have the Polish armed forces. You have sailors on troop ships over to New Zealand, airmen over in Canada. You have them ferrying aircraft across Africa. You have the three services under British command in North Africa and in Britain as this staging post, as well as the Polish Second Corps and their epic odyssey from Siberian captivity through to Persia and Palestine and on into the Italian campaign. But our focus today is going to be on this chap in the middle here, Colonel Maciek. He had earned his stripes in the First World War in mountain warfare in the Austrian army, and had then fought the Ukrainians and the Bolsheviks in the early days of Polish independence. In September 1939, he commanded the 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade. This is the only entirely mechanized unit in the Polish army. And as we've mentioned before, let's not get ahead of ourselves. In 1944-45, the Germans are still using horse-drawn trucks. Now, though massively outnumbered, we need to challenge the idea that the German invasion of Poland was a walkover. For a week, Maciek's brigade held back a German panzer division as it had attempted to break through the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest. But from that point onwards, the brigade was largely tasked with fighting a rearguard action, moving eastwards towards the defense of Lvov, or Lviv today. Following the Soviet invasion of the 17th of September, the brigade was ordered to cross into Hungary with the view to joining up with the new Polish army being formed in France. The Hungarians interned the Poles and disarmed them, but using what I will term various ruses, they managed to escape via various routes through to France. And they'll be safe there, fine, yeah, okay. So Maciek meets up with the new Prime Minister of Poland and Commander-in-Chief, General Sikorski. Now promoted to general, he is tasked with overseeing training at the Polish camp in Kołaki, which you can just see marked with a star to the southwest of Rennes. This had been used actually by American troops during the First World War. Now, the new Polish army consists not only of regular soldiers, but also volunteers from Poland and the Americas, as well as conscripts from the Polish population within France. This slightly elderly chap on the left at the bottom is actually Joseph Lipski, who's the Polish ambassador to Berlin, and is clearly redundant at this point. Now, a number of divisions were formed, but Maciek held out for the rebirth of the Motorized Cavalry Brigade. When Germany was invaded, his skeleton brigade that was under-resourced, under-trained, fought well, but disbanded on the news of France's surrender. So here we are on the road again. We have Maciek now in rather dappy civilian clothes who's made it down to Marseille. We have the Poles escaping as part of Operation Ariel. So this was a British force primarily to rescue the remaining British forces that remained in France after the fall of France. And this is where a lot of the Polish soldiers had their first experience of the English language. So Sosabowski, the commander of the parachute brigade, talks about getting on board and encountering his first English word, lavatory. Maciek himself makes his way over to England. Only about a quarter of the Polish army in France makes it that far. Oh, Scottish weather. Okay. So the British were now faced not only with the aftermath of Dunkirk, but also how to employ not only the Poles, but the French and all the other European allies who had arrived in Britain. The Poles are by far the most numerous, about 20,000, and they're sent initially to Scotland to build and defend coastal defences. In February 1942, however, the 1st Polish Armoured Division is formed out of these men. on British lines but with Polish unit names. And General Maciek is its commanding officer. And for the next 2 years, it underwent specialist training, inter-allied exercises across the length of Scotland and England. It was always, however, unable to secure sufficient reserves. The big hope was that the Polish-American, Polish-Canadian communities would field these men, as they had in the First World War, but this wasn't forthcoming. Sikorski does lots and lots of trips to the States. As a result, the Polish division was not included in the first phase of the Normandy landings. It finally arrives in Arromanch at the very end of July. And I think if we have a look at the photograph on the left, it is possibly the very coolest look of all. Coming down this ramp with your shades on, it blows me away. Now, the Poles are placed under the command of the 2nd Canadian Corps, led by General Guy Simonds. At this point, it is essential to note that this period of combat, their arrival in France, overlapped with the start of the Warsaw Uprising, as the Polish population attempted to liberate the city from the Germans. So these men are going to go into combat knowing that their friends and family, their capital city, is under fire. At the end of the day, they would gather around radio cars to find out what's the news from Warsaw. Monty, hey? Okay, now Montgomery had visited the Poles in Scotland and hadn't made the best impression. The Poles are fastidious in their dress. Glasgow is full of tailors to take in British battle dress so that they were more shapely. And Monty isn't, I don't know, particularly fastidious. He also made a comment of what language these Poles speak between themselves. Is it German or Russian? And I don't know the Polish for lead balloon, but that went down pretty badly. Now, however, he makes a much better impression. He gathers the Polish officers down to the level of squadron leaders to explain his concerns and his objectives. And the Poles first see action then in early August as part of Operation Totalize. But we're going to skip forward a little bit to the 17th of August 1944. At this point, the Battle of Normandy is approaching its final stages. Kluge has toured his troops, and they are close to collapse. The Germans are hungry, they are exhausted, their tanks are nearly out of fuel. He has asked Hitler for permission to withdraw, and on the 16th, on his own initiative, he orders the Germans to begin their retreat. At the same time, Montgomery and Bradley realize the opportunity created by this pocket that has been created and the need for these Germans to escape through this very, very narrow neck. So the line of the German retreat as they're trying to find routes towards the east and across the Seine determines the nature of combat. We now have columns of staff cars, horse-drawn trucks, tanks forming columns along these limited number of country roads. Unit coherence begins to collapse. Generals take to their feet, and the effect of airstrikes, as you can see on the right, could be absolutely devastating, blocking escape routes. An additional problem was that we have an increasing number of Germans surrendering, which is obviously gratifying, but causes a problem with how to hold them and during active combat. So if we look at the situation on the 17th of August, we can see right in the north, highlighted in the yellow, the Polish division at the northernmost point of the 2nd Canadian Corps. So you'll see that we are moving from discussions previously of the army level and corps to this small understrength division. From the German perspective, we can see them marked by the sort of hatched lines here, these three moves. The Germans are coming in from, the Americans, really need to get that right. The Americans are pushing up through the south, and all of these roads are converging on that little crossroads on the bottom right of Chambois. Now, Maciek and Montgomery independently look at these maps, and the route likely to be taken by the Germans. There are a limited number of roads running from west to east. If you have a look at the map on the right, Google tells us that it's now a 60-minute drive from Chambois to Vimoutiers, but it's overlooked by a particular feature. And this is Mortain, or Hill 262 North. It's got a little buddy, Hill 262 South, just at the south of this road. And the original idea was that the Poles would capture both of these and completely control the escape route. And because of the shape that this made topographically, it looked a bit like a club, so they called it the mace, or machuga. So Montgomery orders the Poles to seal the Falaise Gap, this small Polish division. Effectively, Maciek splits his division into two battle groups. The first, under Zgorzelski, is to capture the crucial crossroads at Chambois. The second, to the northeast, is to capture and hold Hill 262 to block off the German retreat. Now, you'll see, and we're looking at the sort of bottom right map here, but the top box, okay, the Hill 262 is basically in German territory. So not only will we have Germans trying to escape from within the pocket, but also units outside it with freedom of maneuver. And these are not just any mashed up pile of units, but effective panzer formations. So we focus on the second box to begin with, Chambois, and what looks like Daniel Craig, I appreciate, meeting an American soldier. Seriously, we could make a film here. It would be amazing. Okay, so the battle group of Lieutenant Colonel Zgorzelski attacks Chambois. A lot of street fighting is involved, and they finally capture it at around 7 p.m. The later stages of the battle are hindered by difficulties in using supporting artillery because of the proximity of American forces. But a little after 7, we have this symbolic moment of communication being made between the Poles and the 2nd Battalion of the 395th Infantry Regiment of the 90th American Division, which entered Chambois from the south. So we have here on the left Private Wellington and Corporal Grabowski. Now, with the meeting of the two forces, the Americans are finally able to provide supplies for the Poles. They'd had to set out rapidly without refueling and resupplying. And we get these lovely moments. The Polish Americans come through. They insist that the Poles take everything that they can get. Maciek talks about one American of Polish descent was actually given a 2-day furlough for good behavior and came to my tank in order to see the real-life Polish general. He spoke broken Polish as father and mother had taught him, but even without his assurances, I believed he was Polish at heart. And then we get this phenomenal moment where this American battalion is actually subordinated to the Polish battle group, Zgorzelski. So for 3 days, from the 19th to the 21st, Chambois is defended by 2 Polish regiments, an anti-tank unit, and this battalion of Americans. A photograph which I absolutely should have included and didn't shows Maciek celebrating with his men in Chambois in a tent where the carpet is a captured Nazi flag, and they're toasting each other with champagne taken from the German headquarters. In the same raid, they also find Polish vodka that had been taken by the Germans, so you can imagine the celebrations are quite ugly. Now, if we move now to Hill 262, this represents, and I will defend this claim, the most intense fighting of the campaign. It's 3 days of the Poles holding out against attack from both within and outside the Falaise pocket, without supplies, without the ability to evacuate the wounded, and without any chance to sleep. If we look out from today's modern museum, you can see the sweep of the landscape down to the road below. Beautiful, beautiful territory. In the photographs below, you can see the intensity of the combat. You have this steady sweep, very steep sides coming up, and then forest behind, which is where the Poles are attempting to run supply lines. The intensity of the combat results in Polish and German tanks going barrel to barrel, fighting with handguns at the top of tanks, the entire hillside effectively being overrun in all directions at various stages by Germans desperate to escape from within, and by the 21st Panzer Division and units of the 2nd Panzer Corps trying to coordinate more effective strikes from without. So over the 3 days, and I'll go through this relatively briefly, early afternoon of the 19th of August, the 1st Armoured Regiment under Stefanovich seizes Hill 262 from the Germans. And they're just beginning to sort of dig in when the German retreating column begins to emerge on the road at the bottom of this hillside. Now, I think the term we would use is a target-rich environment. They blow the hell out of this column. The road, the terrain are then completely blocked. There is smoke blocking it. So the original plan of them being able to advance to Hill 262 south and then support Chambois falls apart effectively. In the evening, units under Kosciuszki and the rest of the 3rd Rifles Brigade arrive in the Mace area. Quite excitingly, they had originally been sent to Chambois, but had ended up in Champeaux because of a pronunciation issue with the French guide. But it's great, because we now have reinforcements on 262. The 20th is the day. Throughout the day, the 21st Panzer Division advances on the Mace. Other units of the 2nd Panzer Corps attack from the north. They break through the supply lines. Maciek talks about the fury of well-prepared German attacks, supported by heavy tanks, artillery, Nebelwerfers. And then he also talks about ad hoc attacks here and there, like tongues of fire jumping out every now and then from a bonfire. In critical moments, the Mace was attacked from almost all directions. We fought the encroaching Germans even at the medic station and prisoner assembly point. And within this chaos, Poles who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht swapped uniforms cheerily and basically turned around with their rifles, while the Poles faced the horror of bayoneting fanatical German teenagers, the Hitlerjugend that Lee mentioned earlier. Soldiers were pulling themselves up the steep slopes and bent over, pulling themselves up by the bushes. And we have waves of Germans advancing in a suicidal fashion on anti-tank guns and singing German anthems. And the Poles are enduring all of this without any news on when supplies or reinforcements might arrive. Maciek is frantically trying to call in Canadian support, who A, don't believe that the Poles are in this particular predicament, and then we also have a division that just doesn't show up, and there is a sacking, kitchen is fired for that. Now, embedded with the Poles is a Canadian soldier, Canadian journalist, who is serving as a forward observation officer, so directing the artillery. And he later writes up an account of his wartime experiences. It's a little florid, but the Poles do wear their hearts on their sleeves to a degree. So if you don't mind, I will read it through. Not in a Canadian accent, that would be dreadful. Okay. He wrote, so this is the evening of the 20th, middle day. About 6 o'clock, the attack ceased. The battlefield was a scene from a nightmare. On the flanks of the hill, thousands of corpses made a veritable rampart. We had been forced back to the top of Hill 262. Around the wood, which was about 600 meters long and 300 meters across, now filled with the wounded, we had dug trenches which were to be held at all costs. Aircraft tried to drop supplies to us, but all the containers fell behind enemy lines. At nightfall that Sunday evening, the major called his officers together. Out of 60, only 4 were fit to fight. 3 lieutenants, and myself. All the others, including the major himself, were more or less seriously wounded. Lying in terrible pain on some straw, the Polish major found the strength to pull himself upright and give his instructions. He actually gives the instructions in French to better coordinate with the Canadians that were working with them. Polish officers were all fluent in French. I will never forget his words. Gentlemen, all is lost. I do not think the Canadians can relieve us. We have no more than 110 fit men. There is no food and not much ammunition. 5 shells per gun and 50 rounds per man. That is very little. Even so, fight on. It would be useless to surrender to the SS, you know that. I give you my thanks, you have fought well. Good luck, gentlemen. This night we will be dying for Poland and civilization. And as he gave me his orders, he added, carry on with the same tactics. Afterwards, it will be every tank for itself, and then every man for himself. In the morning of the 21st, they hear the sound of Shermans. The Canadians have arrived. And Savini describes how The soldiers told long stories in Polish to the Canadians, who understood not a word, but nevertheless burst into peals of laughter. You get a sense of their hysterical relief. Our victory was total, but at a terrible price. Only 70 Poles survived the slaughter unhurt. I was the only officer still able to stand. The Poles now call that hill Machuga, which means the mace, and that is it exactly. The Battle of Machuga Hill was the final crushing blow which broke German power. Now, we can, of course, question the effectiveness of the entire Falaise Gap strategy of trying to have this short huck and cut it short. The defeat of the Germans was decisive, but not complete, and thousands of German soldiers were able to escape to the east. There was immediate criticism that the Allies had not acted quickly enough, that Montgomery or Bradley or Patton was at fault, and Maciek was summoned and questioned over whether he'd been careless with Polish blood. Eisenhower visited the battlefield 48 hours later, and he described it as the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. I was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Now, the Polish victory was widely feted. Here we have the article in the British Tank magazine which describes the Polish division's role in closing the gap. And the division would push on to liberate towns in France and Belgium and the Netherlands. Maciek and his men received numerous honors. We see Maciek here being decorated with the Legion of Honor. They participated in the liberation of Oberlangen in the top right, releasing Polish women who had fought in the Warsaw Uprising. And in the bottom right, we see them accepting the surrender of the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven. But German occupation had passed into Soviet occupation, and the eastern territories of Poland were taken away due to Yalta. Maciek's home city of Lvov, now Lviv, became Ukrainian, and Maciek had his Polish citizenship stripped from him. He would live in exile in Edinburgh until his death as recently as 1994, aged 102. Now, if you would like to read more, there are fantastic books on the 1st Polish Armoured Division. These are Maciek's memoirs. We have Od Powody do Czołga, for those of you fluent in Polish. We have the French one, and I am delighted to say in November I am helping to edit a collection of his memoirs in English. So that will be out in November. Just a push there. Thank you very much.
Two wonderful, wonderful talks. I'll take a chair's privilege for a moment. Instead of asking questions, it just struck me as I was listening to both of your remarks. What links these two campaigns, the U.S. 30th Division at Mortain and then the Polish armor at Falaise, blunting the German blitzkrieg. In some sense, both these units were a cork in a bottle. Certainly, that was the role the 30th played, and that was definitely the role the Poles played, too. I have 1,000 questions I'd like to ask, but I think it's time to turn it over to the crowd to take us home towards 5 o'clock. Connie?
Our first question is going to be towards the back to your left.
Yes, this is about the 30th. You had mentioned or touched briefly on the 30th being offered up a distinguished unit citation, but it not actually being rewarded. Could you expand on that a little bit?
The short version, a presidential unit citation citing the entire 30th Division, attached units as a whole, was approved in 1945 by Collins, Bradley, Hodges, H.R. Bull, with a note, Eisenhower concurs. It was never awarded. Some of the subunits that were prominently involved were given distinguished unit citations, but the division as a whole wasn't. That paperwork was set aside. Fast forward to 2014, my book's out. I'm going to reunions. The veterans I'm meeting say, we want that presidential unit citation to be issued to the entire division. So the commander of the North Carolina National Guard, his assistant, myself and a bona fide military historian, go about the process of trying to change the Human Resource Command to our way of thinking. That's in the Pentagon. That didn't go so good. We tried the back door through the Center of Military History. That didn't go good. So we had a weekly conference call, and I came up with this obscure way of getting it done. And I said, it says presidential unit citation is what it's all about. We need to get this to the then President of the United States, Donald Trump, for his review. I said, he'll think it's about him. It doesn't matter how we move this ball, but we've got to do it. So I'll be short, I promise you, but it is kind of an interesting story. The North Carolina National Guard was responsible for taking care of Air Force One when it landed in anywhere in North Carolina. Trump happened to be coming into Charlotte. They got clearance from a World War II veteran to meet him when he came down the ramp of Air Force One. World War II veteran hands him a briefing book about this thick, 2 pages, real simple. Trump hands it off. It goes up onto Air Force One. What can I do for you? Get it done. Trump says, I'll get it done if it's the right thing to do. My name was inside that binder. Now, that isn't... The big deal was that he handed it off to the National Security Council. Bolton spearheaded the effort. It was still going nowhere. So about 6 months later, there's a new adjutant general. He takes pictures of reunions into the office of his congressman, Mark Meadows. We're losing these guys. This is long overdue. Meadows says, well, I can get something done. So he has Trump's cell phone number. He calls Trump. It turned out that Mick Mulvaney, who was the current chief of staff, was kind of tied in with what the Pentagon didn't want to do. And the way you avoided things getting done was don't show them to Trump. Well, Meadows changed that. It was signed that afternoon. That's how it happened.
So they did get it?
They were awarded formally the Presidential Unit Citation, and I watched the colors being put on their flag by the two surviving veterans of Mortain in 2018. Finally took place.
Our next question will be right in the front.
I guess this is for all you folks. Listening to your talks and some of the others and thinking about battle bulge and things like that, it seems like, particularly when the Germans go on the offensive, a handful of determined folks stop them. Is that due to the German way of thinking about war or just dedicated people wanting to do? It just seems that theme occurs over and over again, and I was wondering if anybody thought about that.
Rob, do you want to take it?
If you're asking what I came to understand as esprit de corps, unity, love for the guy next to you, you know, GIs, their war was, there was no big picture. All that we can see today, everything we benefit from, they couldn't see much beyond their foxhole. What I came to understand about the Old Hickory veterans and certainly the 18th Infantry veterans, when I'd go to their reunions, it was to watch the current serving members of the 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team greet, much like the World War II veterans were greeted when they came into this hall, and then to be able to sit and talk with those guys and understand that Their war changed if they lost a good friend. They fought to protect one another. You would see selflessness. Individual acts of courage were so common as to be unrecognized, not rewarded. No ribbons, no medals. It's just what they did. I don't know. You saw that. I could see the passion in the Polish army. I can speak only as a writer, and having sat with a lot of these veterans, to see them tear up when they talk about losing a friend, you can't capture those moments in a book. But I thank you so much for asking me to try to explain it. Thank you.
If I can just add, I think one of the challenges we have when we're talking about the polls, and particularly if we talk about like Squadron 303 and why they're so effective, and everyone just goes, but they're so motivated, aren't they? And you think, well, they are, but they're also phenomenally well trained. Maciek is an incredible commander of men, and in his memoirs he talks about men are just men, the men that you are commanding. It's very rare that they will be lifted to the heights of heroism. He focuses on the training. And I'm sure there's been studies on how far a sort of order of the day compels men. But it came down to these guys were really well trained and very, very well resourced. And yeah, you could talk about Polish spirit and so forth. Would a British division, a Canadian division in the same position have done as well? Quite probably. Did it mean more to the Polish? Yes. Okay, thank you.
The next question is going to be near the aisle in the center.
So, Dr. Citino, I have read your books on the German army, and so my question is prompted by the question that was just asked a few minutes ago. Do you think that the German army, even in the Battle of Normandy, was ill-suited to a direct frontal attack as opposed to the sweeping, enveloping attacks that they seem to have preferred over the centuries? And one last question, asked to Ms. Grant, what happened to your grandparents who went to Siberia?
Jenny, why don't you take that one first? Why don't you take that one first, then I'll answer your...
Yeah, no, thank you. So I had, my grandmother was 18, a schoolgirl, and when the Germans invaded from the west, they were living near Warsaw. Her father made the decision to move the family towards the east, so they were swept up in deportations. He was a forester, so a state employee. And she was really lucky in that she was 18, her brother was 14. So despite the fact that her father had a stroke as a result of imprisonment, they were able to work hard enough to survive, and that family unit survived. Her younger brother was forced into the Polish army in the east. He participated in the liberation of Berlin, but he was messed up. He had to do an awful lot of things that weren't really mentioned in order to survive and so forth. So, and her parents eventually made it, but not until the late 40s back to Poland. She didn't see them again, I think, until the 60s. My grandfather was an army officer. He was, thankfully not sent to Katyn. He was sent to mines. We have this fragment. It's half a scarf that his friend shared with him, and it probably saved his life. And then when it was the amnesty, he joined the Polish Second Corps, and then fought as an artillery officer at Monte Cassino, and then was involved in training through the Italian campaign. They had a choice of settling in either Argentina or the UK, and chose the UK. But one of the conditions that allowed the Poles to resettle, the Labour government had to make an arrangement with the trade unions that the Poles would not pose a threat to British employment. So the Poles could only take on jobs for which there was massive vacancies, which left them with things like the textiles, mines, agriculture. So my grandfather, who before the war had a very lovely time, we have photographs of him with his horse, there's mention of various attractive Ukrainian mistresses and so forth, is now working nights in a textile mill in Bradford. And he dies probably before his time in sort of early 60s. So they had 3 daughters who are now across the world and many grandchildren and so forth. But yeah, I think we were talking about sort of memory earlier. We talk about memory of the war, and the Poles very much lived with this fact of exile. He came from Lvov, he couldn't go back home. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yes, a good question, I'll rephrase it as, what was the German army good for in 1944 in these battles? This isn't the German army of 1939 and 1940. It no longer has the cohesion that it had. Then it's taken colossal losses in the East. And so new recruits, it's filled with new recruits, even the SS divisions. Certainly there's high cohesion on the part of a unit like the U.S. 30th Infantry Division or the Polish Armored Divisions. German ranks are filled with Osttruppen. These are Soviet POWs who have been drafted into the ranks. They're up and down. Every division you can possibly imagine has Osttruppen in them. They give a good accounting of themselves, but there's also the matter of Allied air power. We talked about the difficulty in closing the Falaise pocket, but Jenny also put up a couple of photos which showed you what was happening to German troops inside the Falaise pocket. Whether a few managed to escape, cross a river, abandon your tank, and swim naked across the river to live to fight another day. But as an army, the Germans were destroyed at Falaise. I don't think they were any longer, these are the sweeping maneuvers of yesteryear, however you put it. I think I wrote that. The sweeping maneuvers of yesteryear are no longer possible because the German army simply doesn't have the fuel for them. There's no more Luftwaffe thundering overhead, which makes those brisk and exciting maneuvers possible. Overhead, the Allied air forces are thundering on a nonstop basis. The Germans can't even move by day. But if you think of what kind of advantage your opponent has when you can only move at night, they have a 24-hour clock, but you have an 8-hour clock, and that's what the Germans were fighting. So it's unit cohesion, and I really like the answers I just heard from my colleagues up here. Definitely the Germans no longer have the cohesion, but they also don't have any air power.
Okay, our next question is going to be in the back.
Thank you. Today's symposium has been outstanding. A big thank you to all who participated. Excellent, thank you. My question to you, Jenny, is on one of your slides, you had an illustration of the pockets. How big of an area was the pocket?
That's a good question.
I had that on my notes earlier, and I'm happy to delegate that precise information.
If by the end of the Battle of the Falaise pocket it was 2.5 square miles, I'd be shocked. The gap through which some Germans were managing to escape was a matter of dozens, maybe up 100 or 200 yards, but usually a lot less than that. And every inch of that pocket was being swept by Allied fire. I talk about air power. I always like to talk about air power for some reason. We forget the good something else the Allies had, good old-fashioned artillery. Guns lined up hub to hub, just raining down high explosive on every inch of that pocket. So I don't have the exact, but again, it's very small. That's the point we're making.
Thank you.
Sure. It's a sort of obscure fact that I deal in.
Any more questions? We have one in the back.
Thank you. Dr. Grant, I know you touched on this briefly, but I'm wondering what is, in terms of remembrance, how are surviving Polish veterans of World War II remembered there today?
Good question.
That's great. Just to keep my supervisor on side, I'm not a doctor yet. I'm a third the way through it, so I just have to be hands up on that one. Yeah, it is fraught. As I say, I was looking at the 1984 D-Day celebrations, and this is the first time, really, that the French government had taken over the commemoration. It used to be in veterans organizations, and the British put together their sort of party. And they forget to invite the Poles. It's that simple. There's nothing malicious. They genuinely forget that the Poles are a thing, despite the size of the population. And we see this in 1966, where the Ministry of Defense is invited to the funeral of General Balmer, who had commanded the Home Army during the Warsaw Uprising. And the MOD just shrug it, they ignore it. And you have senior air commanders who had served and tried to sort of create the Warsaw Bridge to supply these the Warsaw Uprising from Italian bases, saying, how can you do this? Like, this, so many Allied men died for this, and the Poles thought they were forgotten. So there's a genuine factor of the British forgetting about the Poles, it just not being part of the story. And I swear, if it was not for the Battle of Britain movie, please tell me we've seen the Battle of Britain movie. No. Okay, well, that's your homework. That's your prep. I'm sorry. That's okay. So there's a scene in this, and it's about 303, Squadron 303, who are on a training flight. And they spot German aircraft. And these are guys who have been instructors at Demblin, at the Polish sort of aviation center, and they peel off, Paszkiewicz peels off, and they go and they deal with the Germans, and they're obviously chastised, but the next day they become operational. And one of the sort of, my Twitter handle, Silence in Polish, they are berated by their sort of British and Canadian commanders saying, no, we need to break away. And they're saying, what? And they're sort of going, Niemcy na dole, Germans over there. And he's saying, silence in Polish. Okay, so you've got this idea of this communication issue. I don't know where I've gone with this, actually. So Battle of Britain movie, you've got A Bridge Too Far, you've got the Polish Parachute Brigade, but it's just not really a feature of British commemoration. It was actually really nice. Yesterday's ceremony, there were 20 veterans of the Normandy campaign that sailed over, sort of sponsored by the Royal British Legion. And one of those was a member of Maczek's division, who, yes, technically wasn't there at D-Day, that they came later. But for that to be considered was significant. In 1984, the only reason that a Polish general was invited, Maczek was too ill at this point, so Rudnicki was invited, was because this really, really angry Polish veteran living in Holland Park had sent letters to Thatcher, to German newspapers, to the MOD, and eventually he sort of, it was one-man pile-on, forced them to issue this invitation late. But this is kind of the Polish perspective, and it's kind of ingrained in me now of just trying to bash away for validation and acknowledgement of the Polish contribution. And I know as a historian that's not great. It means that you're not necessarily critical or self-reflective of that contribution, but it is kind of the dynamic of Anglo-Polish memory of the war in England. Yeah, thank you.
I'm telling both Jenny and Bob that they really, I think, need to find some subjects that excite them next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Citino, Bob Balmer, and Jenny Grant.
Wow, so here we are. At the end of 2 days of celebration and commemoration here at the National WWII Museum. Again, I'd like to thank Rob, Robert, and Jenny for a great way to cap this all on off. I'd like to thank our 11 speakers that we've had today that really brought a new perspective to our symposia here. I'd also like to thank all of you, the visitors who attended this. Many of whom were here all day yesterday as well, and those who have been joining us online. I've been getting emails all day from those who have been watching us, and so the hundreds that are here, it's thousands online. I would also, of course, like to thank Connie Gentry for being the woman who put all this together. And of course, the mighty Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy team. It really is a team effort, and it's great to watch them all work together. So if you missed any of the sessions, you can always refer to the museum's YouTube page where they will soon be uploaded so that anything you missed or anything you want to dig a little deeper into, you can. To close out these 2 wonderful days of celebration and commemoration, we're going to end where we began. Yesterday was about commemorating, thinking about what those men and women did 80 years ago today and yesterday. But today was about taking a deeper dive and learning. And I know I speak for all of us, and I guess I literally am speaking for all of us, that I'm walking away having learned a lot. And one of the things that I love about today and that has made today so special is that we have had discussions about topics we don't typically do here. And while we unapologetically focus on the American story of World War II here, it was wonderful to hear about the Canadians and about the Polish and about the British, our allies, and even that other strange ally, the aviators. But it's great to learn more about all of these, and it's gives us a fuller perspective and a greater picture of what was on the line and what was achieved 80 years ago. So we'll end it all on off and say thank you all for coming, and let's have one round of applause for those who fought and won 80 years ago. And we look forward to seeing you again at the National World War II Museum. Thank you for coming.